Welcome to the Linden Hills History Study Group's virtual history program. Closing time, saloons, taverns, dives, watering holes of the Twin Cities. And here's the book. Got it at Majors and Quinn's. It's one of their staff picks. Yes, it is. There's Andy with his. Yeah, very fun. Published by the Minnesota Historical Society. It is a respectful take on our local history from an unusual perspective. Watering holes. The authors dug into a broad array of resources to tell rich and entertaining stories. The book is available from many booklet outlets, as I said, like Majors and Quinn. Bill Lindeke is an urban geographer, writer, educator who focus on how our environments shape our lives. He has written a column, Cityscapes for Minneapolis, and articles for City Pages and Growler. He is the author of the book Minneapolis, St. Paul, Then and Now. Be sure and check out his blog, Twin Cities Sidewalks, the view from the sidewalks of Minneapolis and St. Paul. In the blog, he dives into a lot of topics with appreciation for both the historic and contemporary. Andy Sturdevant has been described as one of those charming, inquisitive writers who reminds you the world is more interesting than it has any right to be. He is an artist and writer living in Minneapolis who focuses on art, history, and culture for a variety of publications, including the MinPost column, The Stroll. He currently writes a column for Architecture Min, and he is the author of Potluck Supper with Meeting to Follow and the book Downtown Minneapolis in the 1970s. Take it away, Bill and Andy. Thank you.
Thanks, Joellen. I am Andy, as promised. And yeah, Bill is on his way. I'm sure he's probably drunk in a ditch somewhere. So I don't know, hopefully some passerby will recover him and prop him back up and get him in here. But yeah, this is going to be kind of a funny program tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. There's a certain type of hell, I think, where you're watching yourself like on screen while you're not talking. So what Bill and I did actually is recorded the program kind of beforehand. It's about like 50 minutes or so. So we're going to watch that, and it's going to be as if I'm presenting in real time. It's going to be kind of an interesting illusion. So as promised, I will be kind of I'll be going off in the chat too. So there'll be some kind of metatextual commentary going on there. So keep your eyes on that. And actually, if you have anything to add, obviously the people on screen will not be able to hear you because they have ceased to exist many days ago. But I will be able to hear you or see your chat. So yeah, if you have anything to add, please jump in the chat. So there'll be kind of two streams. And then at the end, Bill and I will be here, live, and we'll be able to answer any questions you have. And I'm wearing the same shirt I wore when I recorded this too, so it'll be almost perfect continuity between the two. It's very exciting. But thanks for coming. This is actually my second time addressing the Linden Hills History Group, and it's great to be here. Good evening, Linden Hills History Study Group. My name is Andy Sturdevant. I am one of your co-presenters this evening.
I'm Bill Lindeke, your other co-presenter. It's an honor to be with you today.
It is indeed. So we are, this is a very postmodern setup we have here. This is a pre-recorded presentation that we are giving you that we're treating more or less like the kind of presentation we would be giving to you live, but in a kind of an amazing twist. We will also be attending our own talk out there in the digital audience, probably chiming in on the chat feature for those of you watching. So not only are we presenting to you from days earlier, but also we will be there in person. And then after our recorded remarks here, we will have some time for questions that you might have about the book that we wrote, or probably more likely, some of the bars that you would like to talk about. One of the great things about this project is getting to talk to people about bars that they love, which takes on a very poignant quality in this environment, as you might imagine.
Yeah, Andy and I wrote this book that we'll be talking about today, which is called Closing Time. So, which you can hear about here, but it is the story of the full title, Closing Time, Saloons, Taverns, Dives, and Watering Holes of the Twin Cities. It's basically a history of 50 noteworthy bars or saloons throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul history, starting from the very beginning in the 1840s with the beginning of St. Paul and going to the present day. Almost all but two of the bars are located within the city boundaries. Or is it all but one?
I think all but one. I think there's one in Richfield.
Right. We were initially going to include the bar at the MSP airport, but it got cut from the book at some point, which is
Good for space, but it happens. There's lots of tragedies in life.
Yeah, so it's a interesting history, and it's kind of a little known, and it's actually well known, some of these stories, but little told histories of how saloons and bars and taverns and sort of drinking culture kind of reflects the broader history of the Twin Cities.
It does, yeah. When you're talking about saloon culture, I mean, it really is a sort of lens that you can use to look at the larger history of a place and the people there and how they spend their time, what they value, and it becomes a way to talk about immigration and gentrification and race relations and just all these other broader topics that get played out in traditional kind of mainstream histories, but played out on a very kind of micro level.
Yeah, and especially sort of the changing economies and class and immigration and growth and then gender relations also, and questions of politics and morality and even the changing boundaries of the cities. So it's really sort of a microscope for looking at how the Twin Cities grew and developed and changed over time.
And on that note, so whenever we do these talks, we like to tie in some kind of local angle, hyper-local angle. So, when we were first approached to do this, we thought, oh, okay, well, we can talk about maybe one of the taverns or saloons that was well known in the neighborhood of Linden Hills. And I imagine there is a soft chuckle peeling through the audience now because everyone knows that the upright people of Linden Hills would not permit such an establishment in their city. And that's, as far as I can tell, that's true. If somebody knows about some kind of saloon or tavern that existed in Linden Hills at some point, we would be happy to hear about it in the Q&A section. I couldn't find anything, but that's not unique for Linden Hills. I mean, the nature of Minneapolis as a city, and this is where it's quite a bit different than St. Paul, is that most of the places where you would think about a bar where you could get a whiskey, like, get a strong liquor drink, are circumscribed to very specific areas. And this here is a map of laying that geography out. These were the liquor patrol limits in Minneapolis that were instituted in 1886 and hung on until the 1970s. So that's almost a century, and it really shaped the nature of the neighborhoods of the city. Bill, I think I pulled this image from your website, actually.
Yeah, it's a great. That's a 1930s map, and you'll see that there are some dots outside of the limits. Those are places that were grandfathered in, so they were very valuable spots that were outside of the patrol limits, and a few of them even lasted until the modern era.
Yeah, and the liquor patrol limits are really, there's a lot of political delineation here. The reason why so basically it meant that if it was outside the liquor patrol limits, you could just sell 3-2 beer, which is why to this day, still in South Minneapolis, most of the bars, that you can go to at one point, if they predate the 1970s, were 3-2 bars. They were bars where they sold 3-2 beer. And it was really only in these limits that you could get some liquor. So if you look at that, that's basically Northeast Minneapolis, that's the West Bank, that's the little Hub of Hell section, which is down there in Seward, which is near a bunch of factories, and it's downtown. So if you think about, the kind of the cultural makeup of those neighborhoods, especially in the case of the West Bank and Northeast, they're immigrant-heavy neighborhoods. They're neighborhoods with an immigrant population where the culture of the countries that those Minneapolitans had come from related to liquor quite a bit. So that's a lot of Eastern Europeans in Northeast Minneapolis, and that's a lot of Scandinavians in the West Bank. And there was political will to push back against kind of limitations on the type of drinks that people could get. And the reason why you will not find that kind of thing in Linden Hills is very much because of community figures like this gentleman, the Reverend P.A. Cool, who was the pastor of the Linden Hills Congregational Church in the early 20th century and was very involved in the anti-saloon movement, the temperance movement. That was a really strong presence in Protestant Minneapolis. For much of the 19th century and for a lot of the 20th century as well. And you can see he lays it out really nicely here. Why do people rush to Linden Hills to build their homes? Why do they pay enhanced prices for real estate so far from the center of business? It's because they know the saloon cannot follow them beyond 6th Street. 6th Street was the boundary. And so he's laying out kind of the rationale for why somebody would want to move to Linden Hills to be away from saloons.
And I don't know, there might have been a 3-2 bar in Linden Hills at some point.
I'm sure there must have been. We were really eager to hear about that afterwards, so please set us straight. We're here to be set straight. So in the 45 minutes or so that we have, Bill and I picked 4 bars each, and we're just going to do kind of a quick tour through history here and look at some of them. Just to spend a couple minutes on each one. There's 50 bars that are profiled in the book, and it wasn't completely scientific in terms of how we determined which bars were going to make the cut or not. The idea was that we try to place them all throughout the kind of timeline of the Twin Cities, and so we have some that are very old and some that are more recent, and we kind of imagined, like, if you think of it as a bar crawl, from each bar you're moving ahead about 5 or 10 years or so, starting in the 1840s and going to almost the present. I think the most recent book, the most recent one in there was the Town Talk, which of course has ceased to exist.
And then also spreading out the bars around the geography, and also what sources we could find, because it is very hard to find information about a lot of these places in the historical record.
And the historical record is kind of what guided us, actually. So the first bar we're going to talk about is Cantiony's Last Chance Saloon, which was located at what is, in my opinion, the greatest address in the history of Minneapolis, 1 Nicollet Avenue. I mean, you can't think of a more iconic address than that. In Cantiony's Last Chance Saloon, this is the only picture of it that I was able to find. And you'll say, well, Andy, that's not a saloon. That's the Hennepin Avenue Bridge. Well, yes, that's correct. But if you let your eye kind of gaze to the right of that, you will find Cantiony's Saloon, which is that kind of perfect Western bar looking building right there to the right. In the early directories, Cantiony's was listed for their address as, next to the Hennepin Avenue Bridge. So, like, from a marketing perspective, you have really the greatest, location that one can imagine in the Twin Cities. I mean, at the time there were 114 bars licensed in Minneapolis when they opened, and of all of those, you had this one right there at the front part of the bridge. The idea of a last chance saloon is a really kind of common 19th century idea. That it's one of those kind of memes that you see a lot at the time. A last chance saloon is a saloon that is right on some kind of political boundary. So, and usually a political boundary where the liquor laws are different in one place than in the other. And so this is right on the border of Minneapolis and the old St. Anthony. And by the time Cantiony's had opened, Minneapolis and St. Anthony were one city, but there was still kind of a cultural memory of those being two distinct cities. And so Cantiony's was run by a guy named Caspar Ober-Cantieny, who had come from Switzerland. He was a carpenter. It's possible that he could have even built the building. I think about 95% of the bartenders 95% of the bar owners in Minneapolis at the time lived above the bars that they operated, and that's the case here with Cantiony's. You've got that upstairs where Cantieny and his family lives, and then you've got the downstairs, which is where the work is done. The way I found out about Cantiony's is there was just a single reference to it in a newspaper article from the 1940s, and kind of a, hey, you remember the old days? You remember Cantiony's Last Chance by the bridge? And I'd never heard of it. It had never come up in my research, and so I was able to kind of follow a trail of research back to finding the original place. So yeah, Cantiny's was right there at the bridge, and one of the things when you're doing research like this is just kind of getting these sad or interesting or sad or and interesting, often at the same time, stories about the people that operated these places. In the case of Cantieny, Cantieny seems to have been this really well-liked figure, but he had a son named Tony who was not well-liked. Tony was kind of a reprobate, kind of always getting in trouble. Just sort of a dude with a bad reputation, and he seemed to be kind of one of these guys that was looking for trouble, and then he found it. He got into an altercation with a cop one night, and he had a gun with him that had been pawned to the bar, by a lumberjack or somebody earlier in the day. At the time, the bars were kind of community centers, so if somebody places where people gathered, and there was a lot of informal banking that took place there in lieu of kind of formal banking structure. So, somebody had probably dropped off their gun, pawned it for a couple dollars until their paycheck, came through. So Tony went out with the gun, again, got in an altercation, ended up shooting this police officer, and the police officer died, and which is apparently the first police slain in the city of Minneapolis. And so there was a big trial, and there was a mob that came after Tony, and they tried to hang him, and they had to call in the National Guard to protect him with rifles, and eventually he went onto trial, and then went to jail, went up to Stillwater for a couple of years. And during that whole time, his father was appealing to the political powers, to the governor, to try to get him released. And eventually he was released, but it ruined both of them. Because at some point the bar was demolished, the building was demolished, and they both kind of faded into obscurity. Tony died kind of early, and his father lived for a couple more years and was also owned bars. But in this kind of wave of what you now call urban renewal, the Cantiny's building was demolished to make way for what would later become the train depot, which stood at that site by the bridge for many years to follow. So there's the pitiable story of Cantiny's Last Chance Saloon for you.
Yeah, if you want to see a saloon setup that's similar, where you can actually notice this at a lot of different bars, where there'll be apartments above, and then that's where the saloon keeper would live, and a separate entrance, the staircase going up. And there's a brewery over in St. Paul that dates back to the 1850s called Waldman's that has that setup on the exterior. It's sort of the classic saloon setup. So the next one is the Rogers Hotel. So this was a downtown hotel that was sort of famous for in the early 20th century. So Minneapolis was booming at this period. It had grown very quickly from the 1880s onward, and this Rogers Hotel was owned by a guy named Toozy Rogers. So Tooze, but I think he pronounced it Toozy because he was very good at branding himself and had his logo with two Z's on it that would be on all of his merchandise, his bottles and coasters and keychains and things like that. He sort of got his start in the Gateway District as a saloon keeper, working at this place called the Mint Saloon. The Gateway District is next to Cantiny's train station that Andy was just describing. This was sort of the heart of the bar district in downtown Minneapolis, and a lot of the working people, especially itinerant workers, would hang out there, and so you could make a decent living giving them alcohol. And Toozy Rogers was pretty good at trying to be the respectable saloon keeper, and so when he got caught with gambling in his establishment, which was against the rules, he made a big show out of not knowing about it and then trying to atone for that and this kind of thing. And so trying to be one of the more the kind of the face of the saloon culture and getting involved politically in Minneapolis and trying to fight for the rights of saloon keepers. And eventually he worked his way up through the 1890s to owning this really nice hotel, the Rogers Hotel. And he actually owned a couple of different hotels and bars. Hotels and saloons were always sort of combined, especially in the 19th century. So this was a classic case of that, where there'd be a hotel bar inside, and it was also sort of a popular place for people to go eat lunch. Toozy Rogers became famous for his having a free lunch inside. So in the early 20th century, this was a common way for saloon keepers or bar owners to entice people in off the street and come in and eat food. There'd be a spread, of whatever snacks and food and like prime rib sometimes. So Tuesday had the nicest free lunch in town. And the idea is you give people some food and then they spend the next 4 hours drinking in your establishment and you charge higher prices and make all your money back that way. And the Minneapolis City Council, led by their health commissioner at the time, thought this was horrible because it encouraged sloth and idleness and intoxication. And so they tried to ban the free lunches in downtown Minneapolis. And Tuesday was one of the figureheads of trying to push back against it, claiming that it's feeding people who need food. So why is that a bad thing? And so it became this whole deal. Tuesday Rogers ended up dying in the 1930s, but before he did, in 1914. He died in 1912. Okay, I looked it up. He died in 1912. The saloon lasted until the 30s. But so his wife took over the establishment and made a big show out of giving turkey dinners to all the city's newsboys every Thanksgiving. So they loved Tuesday Rogers, and there was this great description in the newspaper of like hundreds of newsboys. You can picture this is such a cliche, but it's nice to imagine it in Minneapolis, chanting Tuesday's name and giving him 3 cheers after he had died. And so the hotel lasted until 1932 when it was torn down. But yeah, that's the story of Rogers Hotel Bar, and it's it's sort of probably a little bit nicer, but sort of classic example of what you would have seen in the heart of downtown Minneapolis at the turn of the century.
Yeah, a lot of these owners kind of went on to become folk heroes, just because so much of what we know about bar culture in the Twin Cities comes from newspaper reports. And in the case of the Rogers Hotel, it was right near Newspaper Row, wasn't it, Bill?
Yeah, 4th and 4th was where all the newspapers were clustered. Yeah,
so you always got the sense that, if the city reporters were having a slow day and kind of wanted to get the scuttlebutt about what was going on, or, just kind of do a local color sort of column, they'd go down to the bar and kind of, talk to some of the people there and kind of paint these character sketches. And so, in a lot of cases, we know about like what the interiors of these places looked like we know like what was on the wallpaper, like what the fixtures looked like, because, newspapers covered them so lovingly. I mean, not always lovingly. I mean, it was this very like kind of mixed relationship as far as like, kind of being scandalized by some of the stuff that was going on there, but also kind of really genuinely admiring of some of these really unique characters like Tuesday Rogers.
And I think in a place like that, there would have been a real mix of people from like wealthier business types, politicians, journalists, down to your sort of itinerant folks coming off the street, maybe looking for work and getting some free food. And so it'd be a real cross mix of the men of Minneapolis at the time.
And then some women too. It is kind of hard to get a sense for how mixed these some of these establishments were, but especially with the downtown ones, you do get the sense that it really is kind of an admixture of people from all kinds of different backgrounds, that are not always getting along, but are often kind of creating a space that welcomes people that might not otherwise be welcome in kind of the more polite parlors of the city.
Speaking of which, this is a famous bar in the mid-century Minneapolis, the Persian Palms. So it was a kind of a nightclub bar that was located in the heart of the Gateway District from 1942 to 1961. And so, yeah, that's what it looks like now. So it's right on Washington Avenue. Probably all of you know about the Gateway history, the giant urban renewal effort that swept through the post-war downtown Minneapolis. But a lot of that was probably inspired by places like the Persian Palms, which this is the entranceway of it. So the dancing and entertainment, the doors would always be open so that people walking by in the street could get a glimpse inside of what they'd find. And there would be a burlesque show, a musical act. There would be white and black people both on stage, which, for a while was definitely scandalous or definitely different from the rest of the city. And this was a place that that tourists would hear about, or people from small towns in Minnesota or Iowa or Dakotas or whatever. This would be a place that if you went to Minneapolis in the 40s or 50s, you would go there, and then you'd go back and tell your friends all about it and what an exciting city it was. And then they'd go there. And if a newcomer went into the Palms, they would find a just teeming culture and of people inside, including what were called bee girls. So bee girls are sort of vaguely employed by the bar. I like that in this picture you see two actual sailors. We don't think of Minneapolis as like a Navy town, but they look like sailors to me, Andy. I don't know. That's a classic sailor uniform.
That really, yeah, it's like shore leave kind of, yeah.
so the bee girls would go up to a noob as they were in the bar, and then they would flirt with them, and then they ask him to buy her a drink, right? And there's a wink and a nod relationship between the girl and the bartender. So she'd always ask for like the nicest champagne, and they would pour like nothing. I mean, it would be a fake champagne and charge the guy $10 for it or whatever it was at the time. And then they'd split the profits later. So basically that was how you took advantage of these guys coming in from the sticks.
And there's a big like narrative of kind of rubes, like country hayseeds coming into the Twin Cities and then like getting rolled in an alley, or going to the Persian Palms and getting like losing their whole paycheck because they're buying drinks for some girl and then getting thrown out.
When I googled the Persian Palms, there was one of the big hits was in the newspaper archive of the Persian Palms was people in the lost and found section trying to get their stuff back afterward. After a visit there. But then the other thing that was happening at the Palms was there was a stage to the left of this photo, and there'd be a nightly, there'd be 3 or 4 interesting shows going on, including a well-known burlesque performance called Betty's Beef Trust, which was very large women doing sort of a striptease act. Or there'd be like interesting musicians, or there would be contortionists, or the craziest one that I've came across in the records that I was consulting was an underwater striptease act where there'd be a giant tank of water, and then a woman would be in the tank and taking her swimsuit off underwater the whole time. And so this is kind of what you'd see. Music and improper décolletage in the Palms.
And this culture existed. I mean, some of you may even remember, like as late as the 70s, there were still places in Minneapolis where you could go, like on Hennepin, where you could go see a striptease. Some of you that were alive at the time can maybe set me straight on this, but even by the 70s, it really does feel like kind of this charming, nostalgic thing for people, just because, when you compare it to everything else that's going on Hennepin Avenue in the 1970s, as far as like, porno theaters and like peep shows and stuff like that, the kind of burlesque actually seems very wholesome in comparison.
Yeah, and I don't think it was wholesome per se, but
no, I don't either. But
yeah, it was definitely exciting. So there was a lot of excitement in a place like this.
Yeah, I mean, if you're comparing it to like the Alexander Brothers or something, by the 70s, it's like, oh yeah, I'll take the burlesque.
And I think you can even see a set of vibraphone up behind the bar here. I've actually never noticed that before. So there's a stage on the bar. Is that what that is?
Oh yeah, right there on the right. Yeah,
so they must be. I'm sure there was jazz music performed here all the time, and actually, if you wanted to see black musicians, this was maybe one of the places in downtown where they'd be performing.
And that color line codified a lot more aggressively later on. Which brings us, in fact, to speaking of the color line, and also speaking of like genuine folk heroes, the Cassius Bar, which had 2 locations in Minneapolis. The first being on 3rd Street from 1949 to 1958, and the second being slightly further down 3rd Street from 1958 to 1980. Here's the proprietor of the Cassius Bar right here. This is Anthony B. Cassius, who lived a really amazing life. He was born in the South, and he had come up to Minneapolis during the Great Migration. He was the part of a very large family, and was sent up by his parents, after one of his friends was lynched in the South. And so kind of threw himself into, one of the jobs that was available to African Americans at the time, which was in the service industry, and got involved with some of the hotels in town and working in the kitchens there, and was involved in the unionization drives for some of those hospitality workers, and became really involved in the union movement, and kind of became a very influential person politically, but also a very influential person socially too. He also owned a small cafe called the Dreamland Cafe that was down kind of on the 4th Avenue strip, which, around 38th Street was kind of one of the kind of, central points of Black Minneapolis at the time. But he had a cafe down there, and he wanted to open a kind of nice restaurant where people could get food, but also get mixed drinks. And of course, the mixed drinks thing is always the hurdle, because at the time there were very few liquor licenses that were available, and there were almost no liquor licenses that were held by Black folks at the time. And so Cassius made his case to the city council in that very kind of particularly Minneapolis way. The city council denied it, but not in such a way that was overtly racist, in a way that was more like, well, there's already too many liquor licenses, and actually there was some trouble at your other place, wasn't there? And there's this cop that also wants to open a bar, and he seems like a better fit for the neighborhood. So that kind of thing. And he really aggressively fought that. One of the kind of great stories that you hear is the Cassius Bar, when it finally did open. So what happened is he eventually did get the license, and got it really, kind of through the lens of pushing for civil rights, that there should be a nice Black-owned establishment that sold hard liquor in Minneapolis. And so he was able to finally get that license for the first location, which opened in the late 1940s. And the stories that you get is it was really like, it was kind of a community hub for folks that were also kind of on the Great Migration Trail and coming up from the South and coming to Minneapolis and looking for jobs. He said that one of the things that he said is when people, would ask him, "Oh, what's Minneapolis like?" He'd say, "Well, it's a friendly place, but like, don't always be fooled by appearances." So the bar that he opened, and you can kind of get a great sense for the first one. I mean, it really was, you get the sense that it was a more integrated space than the later iteration, that it was, maybe like 60% Black and 40% white. But this is like a real, this is a fancy crowd here. These are folks that are, coming here to get like, kind of mixed drinks. And it looks like, I don't know if it's that's probably a beer bottle. Is it a beer bottle or a bottle of champagne? Front. It's kind of hard to tell.
I think it's larger than a beer bottle.
It's larger than a beer bottle, but you can see the woman on the right is, drinking probably like a sidecar, or something like that. And so the first location was on that 3rd Street until later, and then that building was moved out for kind of an early wave of urban renewal, and so he moved into the second location a little bit later. And one of the kind of great like undercurrents of the book, or not undercurrents, but one of the kind of themes that goes throughout is just the really amazing bar art that you can find. And this was one of the murals that he had commissioned, that Cassius had commissioned at the second site, which was by a Rondo-based artist who had been a former boxer. His name was the Rondo Street Jinx. But he was, he a retired boxer that became a painter. And so there's these really great murals of some kind of, noted scenes in Black athletic excellence. There's the Sugar Ray Robinson fight right here. And then I think there was also Jackie Robinson kind of sliding into home, and then a couple others as well. And in one of these paintings, apparently Cassius himself is painted into the crowd. And when he closed in 1980, it was kind of a big deal. I mean, there was a big newspaper profile, and he put it in really interesting generational terms. He said the reason he was closing is because young folks just didn't want to drink like nice cocktails anymore. All they wanted to do was smoke marijuana.
If he'd only waited another 20 years, he'd be
yeah,
okay.
I know, right? Exactly. And he died not soon after that. But I mean, if you're looking for people to like build a bronze statue of, I think A.B. Cassius is a top candidate.
Yeah. Speaking of weird statues, there's one on the outside of this next establishment, which is a famous place called Palmer's Bar that's still around on the West Bank. And this gets my vote for the bar that I want tourists to visit that come to the city today, because it's in the heart of the old Liquor Patrol limits area, Cedar Avenue being, I think, very close to the border of the West Bank area. So as a result of those limits, the Cedar Avenue is just lined with bars. People from the surrounding working class neighborhoods or from the downtown area would go to the Cedar Avenue to drink. And so probably a third of the places on Cedar were bars at various points. And
a lot of them owned by Norwegians, like rural Norwegians that had come over and had a very, very hard drinking culture that they brought with them.
There's another chapter in here of the Triangle Bar that you can read after you buy the book and enjoy it. But yeah, Palmer's. One of the things I like about Palmer's was my personal experience with it. So it's a place that I have memories of, unlike a lot of the ones that are that we've already talked about, which closed before my father was born, probably. And then, but also it barely survived. Like this is an example of a building that is from the 1890s and became Palmer's Bar in 1906. And so it was really one of the longest lived places. But because Cedar Avenue was, for a time, you can see in the background of this photo, right? The big urban renewal project that was taking over the West Bank Cedar Riverside area in the early 1970s. And I think when those buildings, the Riverside Plaza Towers, were being constructed, everybody thought that this building, this divey, dingy bar on Cedar, was destined for the wrecking ball. There's no way that it would survive. And another thing that was adding pressure to that was that Cedar Avenue was this like highway connection that was planned between 35 and 94 because they couldn't do a full cloverleaf interchange at the intersection there. And so they were going to have to expand Cedar Avenue, and it would have to involve the removal of all these older buildings. So it sort of faded in the early 70s and late 60s that this was going to be torn down. And it wasn't. And so because of a lot of community pushback against the urban renewal plans and expansion, they even took this chunk out of the building. So in this photo that you're looking at right now, you see that there's like a V-shaped top to the building. And so when the Cedar Riverside Plaza project was built, there was originally a skyway that extended across Cedar Avenue that you can see in the background. Palmer's has taken over. But when that was built in the 70s, they took a chunk out of the building and crossed the street and built this weird concrete brutalist skyway that loomed over the sidewalk, and all for the purposes of promoting a better traffic flow through the area. So to me, this is like one of the miracles of Minneapolis, is that in addition to that Vikings game against the Saints, it's this bar surviving the 1970s. So the story in the book talks a little bit about that. But today, Palmer's, you go to it, it's such an interesting mix of culture because it has a lot of the old West Bank hippies. So if you go there and you're lucky, you'll still see Spider John Kerner, the famous 1960s Minneapolis folk blues musician, hanging out. And I saw him as recently as like a year ago. He usually goes and drinks coffee in the afternoon at Palmer's, usually by the doorway that is in the top left of this photo. But so there's this kind of interesting hippie counterculture, artsy 60s stuff combined with like, modern era punks and left leaning sort of anarchist types combined with artists and intellectuals from the West Bank, like the West Bank campus of the university, like where I got my degree, and we'd hang out here. This is where I went after my dissertation defense, actually, with my professors. And then you also get a lot of the Somali community, the ones that are not against drinking alcohol, will come in and hang out. It's probably the East African groups that are maybe Christian, or I don't know. It's a mix of folks, and it's a really interesting cross-pollination and section of what today's Minneapolis looks like, all in this one little spot. So I really like that. It doesn't always go well, so you can show the next photo, Andy, if it's there. So one of the things I like to point out when I go to Palmer's is that they have a famous 86th board, so people who have been kicked out of the bar. And so if you do something very, very bad, you have to do something particularly bad to get kicked out of Palmer's for life. They'll put your name up here and describe what you did slightly, and make sure that the bouncer who will enforce this rule. And Palmer's was just recently bought by a longtime bartender in Minneapolis who's an African-American guy named Tony, and he has pledged to keep it going and sort of be a custodian of this place that has such a rich history. So anyway, this is one of my favorite places in Minneapolis. If you haven't been, I urge you to go if you're at all interested in what we're talking about today, because it's a living history sort of thing. Do you have anything to add about Palmer's there, Andy?
No, I mean, I think this picture of the floor like really speaks to the kind of the almost like geologic layers of history.
Yeah, and did you want to talk about tide houses here with that?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the, when you think of a kind of a standard 19th century saloon, in the style of Palmer's or, something, some of the other ones that are escaping me at the moment. Typically they're called tide houses, which is to say that they had some kind of an economic relationship with one of the local breweries, and it was usually like, the Minneapolis Brewing Company, which made grain bells, or, Hams or Schmitz or some of the other ones. But basically, if you wanted to open a bar, you would make an agreement with the brewery. They would provide all of the furniture. They would provide the fixtures, even down to the floor tile, and you would just exclusively sell their product to all the people that came in. And so, again, it was like even down to the tile. There's a type of tile that you would see at was it the Minneapolis Brewing Company?
Yeah, these are all, I think, grain belt floors.
Yeah, grain belt floors. So yeah, there's a certain type of grain belt floor. So if you really kind of were a real connoisseur and knew your stuff, you could walk in and say, oh yeah, all right, grain belt, here we go.
Yeah, so the fun thing is that you'll see this exact floor pattern at bars still around Minneapolis today. So the older parts of Minneapolis.
The older parts. So moving back into the Gateway District, right, about the urban renewal area, this was another one of those bars that I'd heard about, but was able to actually track down the daughter of the guy that owned it. The Great Lakes Bar and Funhouse was located right in the heart of the Gateway District, at first in Nicollet from 1949 to 1960, and of course that's right in the kind of the heyday of it. But let me see if I can open to the page here real quick, because I want to be sure to get this right, because this is a good one. I was actually able to talk to the daughter of the owner, and she had not just some kind of great memories. I mean, she was obviously very, very young at the time, but actually had some really wonderful photos that we were able to use, including this one right here of the interior. It's very rare to find interiors of some of these places. Just, sometimes you'll get like the external shots just for the purposes of like insurance, photographs, but it's actually kind of rare to find these pictures of the insides, and especially to find kind of people at work here. But John Subak was the gentleman who'd owned this place. He was an immigrant who had come over from Croatia. And when I talked to his daughter, the village that he grew up in was very rural, very remote. They didn't have electricity. and the more that you learn about John Subak and his bars, the more you realize that electricity was something that he did not take for granted for the rest of his life. So every bar needs to kind of have a gimmick, right? Like that's what differentiates you from the rest of the market. And so the Great Lakes Bar and Fun House was exactly that. You look at that name and you think, oh, okay, like a fun house, like a metaphorical fun house where people like metaphorically have fun in this house. Well, no, there was a literal fun house at the Great Lakes Bar in the sense that when you went into the back, and I found the building permits for all this stuff. There was like wavy mirrors and like a literal kind of funhouse environment. There would be puffs of air coming from the floor to, blow dresses up. And there was a guy in a gorilla outfit that, on Friday and Saturday nights, you'd go through the funhouse and he would jump out at you and do his gorilla thing. And this is all the sort of thing that went on at the Great Lakes Bar. It was called the noisiest joint in town. And it appears to have had this reputation for being like this genuinely raucous, wild place. I mean, there were so many, just some of the stories about the stuff that you would encounter when you're in there. I mean, when I say John Subak never took electricity for granted, there was actually electrical charges set up inside the stool. So if the bartender wanted, he could hit a button and you would get like a little jolt. And another thing that would apparently happen is there was this, I guess on maybe slower nights, there was this kind of gimmick where you would walk in and the bartender would go, oh, hey, did you know you're the 1000th customer to come in here? This is great. Here's a present for you. We've been waiting for you. And you'd be like, oh, thank you. This is wonderful. And you would take the present. And of course there would be what? An electrical shock. That would give you a little shock. So this very like kind of wonderful, corny Midwestern sense of humor. Some of the other stories, like they had a floor show where they would put on like a jazz record. Big J. Neely, who was a saxophone player who had a residency elsewhere, on the Hennepin Strip. And so they would put on one of these Big J. McNeely records, and this guy would kind of pantomime playing saxophone, except he would be like playing a giant kielbasa, right? Ha. And there would be a guy behind him that would be mopping up all his sweat because apparently Big J. Neely had a really sweaty kind of floor show, and he was blowing the sax. So a lot of stories like this. But it just kind of speak to just the cross section of Minneapolis. So in 1960 was the first wave of urban renewal, and that's when a lot of the bars in the Gateway District were kind of bought up by the city and demolished to make way for what was going to be kind of suburban style office parks, but in reality a lot of it became parking lots. And so the Great Lakes was one, and there was no compensation to the folks that had their kind of businesses taken from under them. And so John Subak apparently, he was approached by one of his regulars who was a fairly prosperous guy, and he said, John, I'll give you all the money you need, in a handshake loan to get you back on your feet. And and this is kind of reported by John's daughter, and apparently that was the case. He took the money and was able to open a new bar, which actually turned out to be the 5-8 Club in South Minneapolis on Cedar, which later purported to be the home of the Juicy Lucy. But there were a couple photos that didn't make the book here that showed the inside of the Great Lakes right before it was demolished, kind of after it was all cleared up, but before it was demolished. And you can even kind of see like on the walls, there's these like wacky cartoons, and this is in the bathroom here. There was apparently a lot of mannequins in the bathroom. So here's a mannequin who's saying, "Don't hold it too long. Look, gals, here's a strange one," which I think is really charming. So again, that really kind of wonderful, corny Midwestern sense of humor.
It's also got like a Mad Magazine kind of vibe.
There's a definite mid-century like Mad Magazine vibe to it. Yeah, kind of like a Borscht Belt, Mad Magazine. So John Subak is another one of these characters that you encounter that's just kind of seems too good to be true, but it was all true.
So here's another one that some of you might know because it became a famous country western establishment, Lee's Liquor Lounge. This is such a great story, and I do not tell it as well as Brad Zeller did in the City Pages when he covered this. But this is another place that I have personally been to. But the thing that makes Lee's Liquor Lounge so amazing is the owner of it was a guy named Louis. And I only wish that when I first got in there and met Louis, I didn't meet him. Well, he sold me some beers. known more about him and is able to talk to him a little bit. But the other thing about Lee's that I think is interesting is how it illustrates how tied in these bars were with the sort of working class communities around them, because this part of near North Minneapolis is today unrecognizable compared to what this would have looked like in the 1950s or 60s, when this was an industrial area of the city and there was probably lots of factories around here. I think there was a tire factory. I forget what else was around, something involving dairy products. It's written in this book that I wrote, so I should just look it up. But the point is that the bars were deeply connected to working men and the shift changes and the 24-hour sort of culture of working in a factory or working in a shipping warehouse. And as those neighborhoods changed and all they got, as our economy changed and industries changed, and the bars often stayed behind, even though the communities that once like fueled them had gone. So Lee's was one of the many, many, many bars in the Twin Cities that would be paycheck place. So if you brought your paycheck that you just got from your shift being over every week or two into Lee's, they would cash it for you, no questions asked, and the assumption being that you would then spend the money, at least part of the money, at the bar while you're there. And so Lee's was a place like that, and it was started by a guy named Louis Syrian, who bought the place in the 50s, and he didn't change the name. The previous owner had been Lee, and so he felt like that was good enough, and so he just called it Lee's Liquor Lounge. And the one thing that I remember about going into Lee's Liquor Lounge back in the day was that it was always spotless, just immaculate, like Formica everywhere you looked, right? The counters of the bar were just so clean, and there was all this memorabilia of Elvis and other like Budweiser paraphernalia that just had not a mote of dust on it. And I was just sort of, it's something you like noticed only atmospherically. You didn't like notice it right away that, wow, this is the cleanest dive bar I've ever been to in my life, right? And the reason is that Louis, the guy that owned it, got his start working in the slaughterhouses in South St. Paul. Like that's what, when he was a teenager, a young man growing up, he would literally be wiping the floor with mops of the killing floors of the big slaughterhouses. What were they?
Abattoir.
The abattoirs, yeah. The two big, Armour and Swift. So I don't know which one he worked at, but I can only imagine what that does to your psyche to do that for your formative years for, probably grueling hours. And so I think he kept this like very obsessive cleanliness mantra in his mind for the rest of his life. And he would almost always be working every day. He had this mop collection in the basement, which is what you're looking at. These are the mops that were down in the basement of Lee's Liquor Lounge. And after every shift, he would just wipe the place down to just a fine gloss. And that was just evident when you went there. And so he was very fond of people who would come to his country music shows, who had nice haircuts or who dressed nicely. And he thought that was the greatest thing. Anyway, so it's a cool place. It turned into a country western establishment and had honky tonk and lots of bands that would play here. It sort of got a rocket fueled ascendancy because of one particular band, Dale Watson. No, not Dale Watson. The let's see, I'm looking it up. There was the one band in particular that became really huge there in the 90s, and this turned into a real hot spot for a while. Trailer Trash was the name of it. Sort of a honky-tonk, fun hipster country band that did country rockabilly type stuff. Anyway, they had a weekly set here in the 90s, and Louis Liquor Lounge was amazing. But it got sold to, when Louis was getting really old, it got sold to a patron who tried to keep it up. But obviously nobody can fill those shoes. They were too clean to fill. And I think it's for sale right now, actually. I read something about it recently, but it's still there over in the near North Loop. It's one of the closest bars on that side of Target Field. So, um,
oh, sorry.
go ahead. Yeah, that's it. It's still there.
Yeah. We want to say these photos in particular were by Stuart Clipper, who may actually be in attendance tonight. Wonderful local photographer, well, a wonderful international photographer who just happens to live locally. But this was just another one of those lucky things where when I was writing the book, I went over to Stuart's house and we were hanging out, and I mentioned that we were working on it, and he mentioned that he had all these photos of Lee's Liquor Lounge of the interiors right before it was renovated. And so again, it's just to find this kind of documentation of the inside of a place is just really
Especially
kind
the
of rare.
basement. The
Yeah,
basement
especially
is
the
really.
basement. I mean, we could have used all the photos he had because he had dozens. Yeah. All right, and the last one we're going to talk about, we're kind of running out of time here, so we'll get to the Q&A part of the program. But when Bill and I put the list together, we knew the types of places we wanted. I mean, we knew specific places we wanted. We knew that we wanted Palmer's in there. We knew we wanted Lee's Liquor Lounge in there. But then we were also, there was kind of the Donald Rumsfeldian, the unknown knowns, right? Or the known unknowns. And this was one of the known unknowns. Because again, the story of bars anywhere and the bars in the Twin Cities is a very male dominated story, obviously, but not always. They are spaces for the most part where there are women that own them and that are running them. And we wanted to get a lot of those stories into the book as well. And so when I was at the Minneapolis collection at the Hennepin County Library, the Central Library, just kind of looking through their archives, I came across a folder that said "First Woman Bartender in Minneapolis," and I thought, oh wow, how far back is this going to go? And then I looked at the date, and the date was 1969. And I thought, oh, that can't be right. But in fact, that was the case. So this is the story of Judy Jarasak, who's portrayed right here, who was indeed the first woman bartender in the city of Minneapolis in the modern era. At the time, there was a law saying that women were allowed to be cocktail waitresses, they were allowed to be servers, but they were not permitted to be bartenders for kind of morality-based reasons. And Judy Jarasak was a sociology student at the University of Minnesota. She was a divorced single mom raising a daughter. And she'd worked in all the hotels and worked as a cocktail waitress, but she'd picked up the tricks of the trade, and she knew how to mix drinks, and she knew that she could make a lot more money as a bartender. And so she applied to the Bartenders Union for a job, and apparently was one of the highest scoring applicants, in the kind of final exam of all time. And so she got her license, and she met up with these guys that ran this place called the Red Baron, and these were some younger guys, that were kind of catering to a youngish crowd in downtown Minneapolis. This would be definitely where people would drop by for a, lunch, a kind of 3 martini lunch, if they were working in downtown Minneapolis. And there was also a slightly younger crowd too. They had bands at night, and there was a bar in the basement as well. And the Red Baron it was sort of done up in that very late 60s kind of kitschy bric-a-brac style that later became kind of the house style of a place like TGA Fridays. So you kind of imagine the inside of this place as being very much like a TGA Fridays with kind of old-timey World War I maps on the wall and barber poles and stuff like that. But anyway, they were very socially consciously minded, I suppose, and hired her as a test case to kind of see what would happen if they hired a woman as a bartender. And so apparently the Vice Squad showed up, and everybody kind of milled around nervously, and she was not arrested, right? But later on, the bartenders got a summons that they were violating the law, and so this actually did go to, this went to court, and it was decided that that women could be bartenders and that it was a civil rights violation that they could not be. But Judy Jarasak here, I think, kind of got the short end of the stick. She only worked there for that one night. And it's kind of hard to tell what happened to her afterwards. She kind of disappears from the historical record, I think maybe intentionally. I tried to get a hold of her, but I just, the trail went completely cold as far as, where she was. And then the Red Baron burned down a year later. So, it all kind of came to naught. Apparently, the 60s feels like, oh, that's a long time ago. And it is, it seems like, oh, that's not that long time ago, but it is actually a long time ago because, all these buildings were made of wood. They were like left over from the, late 19th century and early 20th century. And they were susceptible to fire. And so the Red Baron, unfortunately burned down. But that's the story of Judy Jarasak.
That looks like it might be a styrofoam drop ceiling, Andy. Is that accurate? Do you think?
That's probably where the fire started. Would be my guess.
Well, that's our talk. They're in the book, and I think we have gone over 8 of them. Is that right?
Yeah, so, there's just 8 of them. Yeah,
and we've only scratched the surface of these 8. There's a lot in here that you might like. You can find it at your local bookstore.
Yeah, order it from your local bookstore. Almost all of them are taking orders online. That's how I'm getting them. All right, so we're going to move to the asynchronous section of the evening. So Bill and I are coming to you from the distant past, and we'll soon switch over to a synchronous present-based reality.
Great. See you soon.
See you on the other side, Bill. Now we're coming to you from real time, I guess.
Yeah, if folks want to ask questions, you can unmute your.
I see a question about the Cozy Bar in Plymouth Avenue, and I do recall seeing pictures of it.
Yeah, the Cozy Bar's in the book. To Richard's question about the Cozy Bar is one of the bars that is included. And there's the story of James Fuller Sr. was the proprietor of the Cozy Bar. And he'd had a couple bars over north, I think starting in the 50s. And like Ruth says, Ruth, by the way, I have to thank you for all your metatextual information. It was so great to have that kind of rolling commentary going in.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So the Cozy Bar was owned by a man named James Fuller Sr. And it was actually demolished for the 94 extension. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 94. And so there was actually it was in some ways it was kind of a parallel story to the story that A.B. Cassius had in his dealings with the city council, where James Fuller was attempting to get a license for a new place and actually did, and opened the Riverside.
Riverview Supper Club.
Riverview, thank you. Yes, the Riverview Supper Club across the river, which was open until not too long ago. But Richard, that's an interesting point. I mean, that's amazing that you sat in with Muddy Waters. That's great. There was an aspect of the book where we were trying to focus mostly on bars that were not music venues, just because there's so many great books, and like Ruth has mentioned a bunch of them, and there's just so many great books about the music scene. We wanted to focus on places that existed more as bars. But the great thing about the Cozy is that it really was like, and I've seen pictures of the interior. You were actually in the interior, so maybe but it seems like it was split between a music venue on one side and then like a neighborhood bar on the other side. And there was definitely a ton of great music that was going on there, throughout the 60s and the 70s. But there was also a neighborhood side where, folks would, they had one of the eye opener clubs, right? Which is usually the nomenclature that you see for, the folks that show up at 8 a.m. to get a drink because they're just, clocking off of their overnight shift at the factory. So the Cozy Bar kind of existed as being, both this really amazing music venue, but also this neighborhood bar. And so we focus more on the neighborhood side. Does anyone have any questions about how horrifying it is to watch yourself talk for an hour on screen?
So I thought is Lee's Liquor Lounge, is that the one that was down by the bus transportation, Metro Transit?
Yes.
And that there was a coordination with it for their parking space and all sorts of a big hullabaloo a couple years ago. Isn't that the?
Yeah, the bar was sold to a patron who said he bought it from Louis, the longtime guy that had like made it what it was, and promised not to change anything. But that's a difficult thing to keep your word on, and I don't know. That area of town is sort of in the shadow of the Herc plant, the garbage burner, the Hennepin County facility, and Target Field. And then on the other side, there's a lot of the city's homeless shelters, and then the bus depot garage where all the Metro Transit buses get maintained, and a lot of them, the offices are located there. And it's a part of the city that's probably seen the most change. It's in the top 5 parts of Minneapolis that have transformed over the century, and so it's quite hard to imagine what it looked like in the 50s compared to today, or even in the turn of the century versus the 50s. But yeah, some parking that Lee's was using on an informal basis got developed by the city, and that's the reason that the guy gave for closing it. But I don't know. Often when bars close, the owners will give all sorts of reasons. Like the smoking ban was one, where every bar that closed within a year of the smoking ban going into effect, it was because of the smoking ban. But honestly, I don't know. I always take those with lots of grains of salt. Those explanations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as bars closing, we weren't aware of this when we were writing it, obviously, but there's a really kind of sobering historical parallel, I think, that's going on right now, because, in 1918, 1919, you had the kind of triple whammy of anti-German sentiment in World War I, which, a lot of the bars were owned by Germans, and the Germans were the targets of a lot of people's ire. That combined with, Prohibition passing in 1919 and the kind of the ramping up of that. And then the flu pandemic too. The flu pandemic closed a lot of saloons and bars. It doesn't sound familiar, Bill? I don't know. There were
Prohibition really is the one that.
Prohibition's the big one.
The final nail.
All the nails. All the nails and the coffin itself. But I mean, there was a lot of pushback from bar owners about closures because of the influenza epidemic.
Yeah, and I never really thought that was a big factor until the current epidemic, and then I think everyone has started researching that period of time more than they had been.
The Silver Dollar Club, Richard had mentioned, I'd seen a little bit about it. It didn't make it into the book, unfortunately. But I got the sense that it was, kind of one of those like 3-2 bars on Lake Street. And like Ruth says, Prohibition did not stop people from going to get a drink, especially if people were relatively wealthy. Not entirely, but it was easier for people that were better connected to keep drinking. The Hollyhocks Club is in the book, and I imagine many of you have read, John Dillinger Slept Here, by Paul Maccabee, which is kind of one of the great works of Minnesota historical nonfiction. But we actually dug into his archive when we were writing about the Hollyhocks Club. Because he was writing that book in the 1980s, and so it was still possible in the 1980s to find people that were adults in the 1920s and the 1930s, and so he had a lot of firsthand interviews with folks that had been at the Hollyhocks Club. And there was a great story about the bouncers were so good that they wouldn't let anybody in unless they were absolutely sure who they were. And there was a story one time about the mayor of St. Paul showing up and trying to get in and getting kicked out because he was not recognizable as the mayor of St. Paul.
The things sort of come full circle. There was you probably all know, but bars were shut down statewide during the spring and summer because of the pandemic. But Moby Dick's bar is in our book, but I heard a rumor, which I find very believable, that there's a specific bar on West 7th Street in St. Paul that I've been to many times that stayed open during the shutdown illegally as a speakeasy. So a lot of the old lifers in the West 7th neighborhood would like have a door knock in particular that the owner would let them in, and they would get to go back to their bar stool during the shutdown, which you shouldn't do that, but it did happen.
It still might be happening.
Yeah.
To Ruth's point about the Green Lantern, I think when we were in the final stages of putting the book together was when that photograph of the Green Lantern turned up, which there had never been kind of a photo that anyone knew of the Green Lantern, and this was the first one that had turned up. And I think one of the reasons we didn't include the Green Lantern is because we just didn't have any good photos of it.
Also because that history has been pretty well covered by others.
Yeah. The Commodore.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. There's about the Commodore is in the book as well. The Commodore Hotel Bar. The Longhorn Bar, not, unfortunately. That's a great bar. And to see the police there would be quite exciting. But Jay's Longhorn seemed like more of a music venue than a bar. And again, it's a very delicate distinction. But we could have made this book 3 times as long and still missed a bunch. Actually, Bill, did I ever tell you? I actually did find out what happened to Judy Jarasak in the early 70s, but it was too hot to put in the book. It was too scandalous.
Oh, I didn't know.
She married the owner of the CC Club.
Ah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I know. So that's a hot piece of gossip for everybody. I don't know what happened to her, though. I didn't want to approach him about can you tell me about your ex-wife from the early 70s?
Isn't that a great opening conversation to have?
I guess it depends. I don't know. Depends on what kind of conversation you're looking to have, I suppose.
Yeah, Mousie's Bar was a Hennepin Avenue downtown joint, and we did not have it in the book. We did put Moby Dick's in here.
Contractually, we had to have Moby Dick's in there. That was
we
not negotiable.
I just spread it out to have different places in different neighborhoods and different eras, and there still are a lot of downtown Minneapolis bars in here. It's probably the most heavily represented section of town.
Yeah, and to Jane's point, I'm not actually sure when the CC Tap became the CC Club. It opened in 1934 as the CC Tap because the owner was named Clarence Campbell. But I don't know when it became the CC Club. I get the sense it was probably sometime in the 60s, but that's just a guess.
One thing that happened, these bars were constantly being sold and bought, obviously. But they would change hands. A lot of them, most of them would change hands, every 5-10 years, and they'd put a new name on it. But not everybody would do that. Or sometimes you'd add a name to the front of the name. So it was probably the Liquor Lounge, and then it became Lee's Liquor Lounge, and then it was Louie's Lee's Liquor Lounge, but they decided that was too much, so they just left it.
Oh, 1980 for the CC Club. Thanks, Jane. That's good to know. That's kind of when the character of the CC Club changed a lot too. I think that's when it became more of a rock club than or not a rock club, like a hangout place, as opposed to an old man bar. I got the sense it was very much an old man bar, kind of prior to 1980, and then all the kids that were hanging out at the record store across the street.
The best places are ones that transition throughout the day. So they start the day in the afternoon and early around till about Jeopardy time as old man bars, and then transition to the younger kids, and then you get that nice overlap between the different kind of groups of the neighborhood.
No, I miss it so much.
Well, we're going to be old men soon, Andy. So
I know, yeah, we are. By the time this is all over, we'll be holding court at our old man bar.
Well, this has been fun. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Maybe we should wrap it up. Oh, here comes some more.
I have heard more stories about Dave Moore hanging out at bars than just about any media figure. So I have to think that I think Dave Moore had also hung out at the Cozy, I think, because he was like a jazz guy. And so, when they would have jazz performances, like after hours, he would apparently. I think it's Dave Moore. That sounds like Dave Moore, but that's not surprising that he also probably hung out at Mousie's.
There ought to be video, like newsreel footages of Dave Moore talking to different people at bars. That would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, a solid Dave Moore biography would be a great service to the Twin Cities.
Bedtime news. Oh yeah, that's what I want to see, is the archive of that.
You talked about Mousie's or the Cozy, David?
Yeah.
Mousie's, okay.
Well,
I could have the wrong newscaster, but I thought it was Dave Moore.
I bet the Historical Society has the archives for the WCCO news.
There was a great website that had a lot of old, like 80s broadcasts, TV news broadcasts.
Oh yeah,
it's called Twin Cities Media now, I think.
Yeah,
and it's pretty wonderful. They had the broadcast from when that big department store burned down on Thanksgiving.
Donaldson's,
and you could watch that, and it's really wild to see.
Well, thank you two so much for this. Oh, here comes more. That's
Ruth. Ruth is very on it today.
She is. We're so fortunate. And Richard too. Don Shelby. Yeah.
Oh God, you know what? I think I am probably thinking of Don Shelby. Actually, I mean, I know the difference between Dave Moore and Don Shelby. Don't throw me out here. But okay, yeah, that totally makes sense.
Well, thanks for all the great questions. It's always a great audience.
It's great to hear from people.
Very fun. And folks, tune in again on November 5th, Thursday, November 5th, for our next program on the history of anti-Semitism in Minneapolis. Not quite as light a topic.
Although, be sure to get him to tell the story about how David Berman rounded up all his mafia buddies and went out to the suburbs to beat up meetings of the silver shirts, who were the Nazi sympathizers. I think that is one of the great stories of Minneapolis history, is that Dave Berman rounding up his toughs to go
really?
to go.
So
beat
is he related to High Berman?
Yeah,
probably.
I think so. I think it's the same Bermans, and his daughter Susan Berman wrote a really interesting, because Dave Berman was the one that went out to Las Vegas later on. And all that's in the Neil Carlin book too. Actually, Neil's got a reading on Monday night for his new Prince book, so you all should attend that too. I'll be there, because you just can't get enough Zoom meetings, right? If you have fewer than 5 a week, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Have a good night.